Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dave West. I'm going to be your host today. I'm CEO here at Scrum.org, and I'm really excited about today's webinar. Over the last 18 months, 2 years, one of those years was COVID years, so it probably feels like 20 years. Matt and Tyson and myself have been talking about the application of Agile and Scrum in research, in biotech research, not a field I know anything about, though luckily I've got these two gentlemen on today that know a lot more about it, and they've been teaching me dragging me kicking and screaming to learn about payloads and gene therapy and things like that. But we've been talking about how we can apply the ideas of Scrum and the ideas of agility really to solve some of the challenges that research teams have. And I'm excited that we have the opportunity to share this with you. And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit of a fanboy of the work that they're doing. And when they get really techie, I go a little bit star-eyed. So I apologize for that up front. But before we actually begin today's fabulous webinar, I want to make sure that I'm on the right screen would help, that we get the sort of the housekeeping items. I'm fortunate that a colleague printed them out and made sure that I'm reading this. Before we get started, this session is being recorded and will be made available within 24 hours. That's our service level. That sounds a bit scary. I'm not sure why we committed to that, but 24 hours. So you'll be able to distribute this to your friends if they have trouble sleeping. No, if they're interested in these topics, or maybe there's a little nugget you wanna share with them, and so you better share it within 24 hours. You'll be muted because the reality of dogs barking, the FedEx guy arriving, children, doing children's stuff. We try to avoid that so that you're muted throughout, but please ask questions. You'll notice in the Zoom technology, there's a little question box. So you can type in some questions, or you can make comments if you've got any particular technical problems. There are people on the line far more capable than me that can help you. But hopefully you can grab some of those questions, put them in, and I can see it's on that side of my screen. I'm gonna read them later and maybe ask Matt and Tyson about them, and maybe they'll kick off some interesting discussion towards the end of the webinar. So Q&A, remember to ask questions. You're muted. You'll get a copy of the slides in 24 hours. Now, for the people that don't know Scrum.org, just to make sure you've not come here by accident because you're thinking it's something to do with rugby, we are the organization that was founded by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum, that really focuses on helping people adopt the Scrum framework in this professional Scrum way. And to do that, we have about 340 trainers all around the world training people. Certification, some of you may have heard of PSM1, PSPO1, etc. And then, of course, thought leadership, of which today we're talking about how we can apply Scrum in that really interesting area of biotech research. So that's who we are. And now I think we want to get started. I'd like to introduce you to, now I've been trying to say Matt's surname for the entire last 5 minutes, but Matt Abbinanti. Which I probably didn't do a great job. I met Matt probably 18 months ago, Matt, and you attended a class, I think, here at Scrum.org, and he was very cynical, a little bit grumpy, and certainly cynical. And he sort of he's like, this is really interesting, but what about this? And as we talked, he told me a little bit about his history, hence the reason why I have that photo of a fireman, because there's a lot of parallels that I think is Scrum with like how teams work when they're fighting fire. So that's the reason why I made him put that up. But Matt, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. My name is Matt Abbinanti, and I got my PhD, and then I started into industry as a bench scientist at Bioaxome Biosciences, and then I spent enough time there to move up to Director of Research and Project Management for them. And we were doing preclinical development of some small molecule inhibitors for neurovascular and neurotrauma. Currently, I'm a senior program manager at CRISPR Therapeutics. There I manage multiple preclinical teams and alliances, and I'll be talking today about how we facilitated the installation of Scrum for one of our research teams. And as Dave said, Dave's always brings up what is it about you that may have made you more open to looking at different ways of working? And so I was in the fire service for about 15 years prior to moving up to Boston. So that gave me a very different point of view away from the bench.
It's really interesting, Matt, because that cynicism that apparently scientists have, scientific method and the like, coupled with your get stuff done, solve the problem, fire service kind of mentality, try everything. I think it's a pretty unique combination, and I've really enjoyed spending time. So great to have you here, Matt. And thank you for taking the time over the last 2 years, actually, but also today. Now, Tyson was actually the person that I first met in this space. So that was a little bit before I started talking to Matt. In fact, we had coffee in the Biotech hub in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I met him and the program manager he was working with, and we started talking about how you can do this. Also, like Matt, he has a little bit of a different history, which is, I think, serves him well in this. So Tyson, Bertmaring, you see, look, practicing. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience today?
Thanks, Dave. So yeah, a little bit different for me as well. My first 12 years, I was in the Air Force. So the 4 of those was at undergraduate at the Air Force Academy. And primarily, you get your degree, but you're really focusing on teamwork and leadership. That's really what you're focused on for 4 years, because they want you to take that out into the field when you serve the Air Force. And so my first 5 years as an officer, I was doing a job that Dave always jokes about with me, where my job was to launch nuclear weapons if ever called upon by the President of the United States. So hopefully, or gladly for all of us, I never had to do my job. But in that process, for every mission we did, we planned, we executed the mission, we came back, we debriefed it to always improve how we did it, because perfection was like expected. We couldn't be anything less than 100%. That was my first introduction to the idea of Scrum without even knowing what it was. And that stayed with me until today. I left the Air Force with the last 3 years. I was doing more traditional project management, where I was working with teams, primarily new technologies for communications and radar systems, to take those capabilities to the field, develop new programs. At that point, my wife, our family, we wanted to think about something different than a full career in the military. And I was in the Boston area, and biotech just made a lot of sense at that point in time. Used a lot of the same skills that I thought I had. And so the first 5 years, I was really focusing on learning how drugs are developed at different companies. Then I went through a stage of really questioning, like, what value was I providing the organization? I felt like I was just moving information around. Since this industry is really complex, and it's not as simple as just following a waterfall Gantt chart. And so then Matt and I did that experiment at CRISPR. It seemed to work on a research team, and I really was interested to see if we could scale that to an entire company. And so the last year I've been doing that at Dyno. And while I'm really focused on the research aspect of it, I had this like tingling sensation of, could we do it in development too? And so I think that's like where I want to think about longer term.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. I think your passion and what you did at CRISPR and learn about it, which we're going to hear about in a moment, with Matt, and then Matt carried on, took that torch and has carried on, and your passion that you've driven into Dyno to try to create an organization around some of these principles, so they're like first principles in the organization, is really, really interesting, and I'm super excited where that's going to go. So the format, so ladies and gentlemen on listening, the format, we'll just spend a little bit of time. Matt's going to start talking a little bit, sort of, it's almost a historic sort of perspective and where they've got to at CRISPR Therapeutics and his experiences along the way. Then maybe a couple of questions, then we'll move on to Tyson talking about what's happening at Dyno. Both of them are sort of talking about it's a little bit different, and hopefully they're going to build on each other's ideas. So Matt, do you want to kick it off? Talk a little bit about your experience at CRISPR Therapeutics.
Sure, David. I just want to make sure I said thanks for inviting me to do this. This is really exciting. So I didn't get a chance to say that the last time. So before you advance the slide, I speak only in my personal capacity. All the opinions are those of me and not any employer in my history or current employer. Okay, go ahead.
That's a very important statement in case any lawyers are listening. So just in case.
I'm going to start the story with, it was actually a really high point. In 2019, CRISPR licensed a preclinical treatment that we've been working on for Duchenne muscular dystrophy to Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And so as a result of that, CRISPR had a really high performing research team that led the preclinical development of this therapeutic, and very suddenly has achieved a huge success, but needed to find something new to work on. So find a new target or targets to engage. And I'll say this with a story is the morning after that got announced, I sat down with one of the lead scientists that was working on the group, and they said, well now what? What's next? And so go ahead, next slide, Dave. And so really it became, we were searching for a way to answer this question. The team received something very rare in the biotech industry, which was given almost full autonomy to search for, to evaluate, and to nominate new targets. Very rare and just a wonderful opportunity for all involved. However, that comes with a lot of challenges. So in the short term, we have the world at our fingertips. How do we evaluate so many different things? But in the long term, what sort of foundation can we lay down so that as we have all these targets and we narrow them down, how can we move perhaps multiple targets through preclinical development in parallel? And we had a couple things that were in our favor. Like I mentioned before, this team had very recently demonstrated a very powerful success. And that led to the team being at a very rare and very major inflection point where we could start something new. Okay, go ahead, Dave. So as the PM involved, as the program manager involved, and I was working with Tyson at this time as well, so he deserves a lot of credit, if not more. If we're going to work, we had immediate thoughts. So if we're going to work on multiple targets at once, we need to be agile. And that's not necessarily, it wasn't even agile as a way of working or Scrum at that point. It was truly, how do we be nimble? How do we bounce back and forth between things? Because we're going to look at things very openly at the beginning, but then we're going to find things out that may make us go, ooh, wait, we don't want to work on this. So this nimbleness and agility, you hear that all the time in biotech and in research too. They're huge buzzwords all the time. However, actually being nimble is very difficult. In general, research in biotech, we aren't oriented towards change. So actually being nimble and being agile is hard. As a way of demonstrating that, projects or programs, we tend to err on the side of them lasting too long versus spiking them too soon. And that's often, the source of that can often be business factors, like we have a lot of money invested in this, or we don't want to look like we're scatterbrained and going in a whole bunch of different directions. But I actually think the base is rooted somewhere differently, even very early on when they're very science heavy. And it's that that scientists are trained to just keep going and keep working and deal with failure and keep trying. So actually being nimble and finding that sweet spot is very difficult. Go ahead. So Tyson and I identified the Scrum Framework as a starting point. So how we're going to organize this team and how we can implement it very early on for some quick wins early on during this target search process. And then in the long term, propel the team to start churning out multiple treatment candidates all in parallel instead of in series one at a time. And I think this is the most important point of this whole talk, and that's why it's highlighted here. We worked really hard on getting a buy-in from the full team. So from our product owner, who would typically be called like a project lead, that's a vice president level person, through all the scientists that were actually working at the bench and leading scientists, and obviously through the Scrum Master for me. But we worked really hard on tailoring this Scrum framework that works best for the team and to get the full buy-in from them. Tyson and I both received the PSM1 certification through Scrum.org, and our very first truly formal sprint was in the month of October 2019. Okay. And some details, I'm not going to really go into a lot of details on each artifact here because probably the audience knows a lot of that stuff better than I do. But what I will say is how we laid the groundwork here. This was very new for pretty much everybody on the team, and it was new for me. So we wanted to build it up from the bottom. And so we really focused on the principles and value, the Scrum principles and values. Transparency, inspection, and adaptability, again, can be kind of buzzwordy, and even in biotech can be buzzwordy, but actually taking it seriously and trying to lay that foundation provides a big difference maker. And the underlying effort was, and still is to this day, to provide safety for the team to act and discuss without fear or hesitancy. When I was a bench scientist, when I was much more science focused, I think my biggest nightmare was looking stupid. But that makes people quiet and worried. And so we're always still trying to emphasize how important it is to be able to speak freely and without fear of shame or being considered, out of the loop. So, and I actually pulled these bullets here at the bottom from the actual presentation that we used to pitch this to the scientists as to what the benefits of using a Scrum framework would be. And you guys are all very familiar with the transparency, the ownership, the trust and continuous team improvement. But what was most cool to the scientists was, oh wait, we can focus on what's important and we can maintain that focus. Go ahead, Dave. So about how things are working now, we originally did month-long sprints because that time is a little more on the time scale of what some of these long experiments, how long these long experiments go. We adapted that down pretty suddenly down to 1 week during the COVID experience because of the type of work that people were doing, being more home-based than lab-based for a short period of time. And we currently sort of settled at a just right level of 2 weeks in duration. We have daily meetings that meet twice a week for 15 minutes. So they're not daily, but they are, we meet often. And we're really focused on like roadblocks to getting work done and follow-ups from previous discussions. And also we've just started emphasizing how updating the group with outcomes of other meetings that maybe everybody wasn't involved with, that doing the daily meetings that the daily meetings are a good place to do that. We combined the sprint review, retrospective, and planning session into one meeting, and that scales with the duration of the sprint. So for a 2-week sprint, currently we have a 90-minute meeting. And that actually requires really staying on topic to get all this work done in 90 minutes. Go ahead. And then a little bit of the outcomes. As of today, we are on our 42nd sprint. Like I mentioned, the first one was way back in October of 2019. During COVID, there were a big emphasis in the company, and I know all the companies, everybody I talked to, about how all of a sudden we needed to meet more often to increase communication, since we weren't going to be bumping into each other in the hallways as much, to make sure that that communication is maintained. We actually didn't need to change anything. We were meeting often already. And then this also allows the team to work on multiple parallel projects at the same time. And that can be really, really difficulty without any sort of framework there to assist with that. This also, so Scrum has helped with that, but working on these parallel projects and programs actually, that de-risks individual failures, right? I mean, they're not real failures, but if something goes wrong or we have a setback, there's still many other things happening that can propel us forward. The team, which I'm just very, very proud of, they've taken this very seriously, and they care very deeply about being very introspective about the whole process. They are self-organizing and they are self-inspecting. They will bring ideas to me without being prompted at all of how we can improve the way we work. And I think that's really inspiring. That the team cares for the objectives and the goals, but they also care about how the method that they use to achieve those goals actually affects their teammates. So they care for each other. And I think Scrum has laid the groundwork for that being an emphasis. And the team is truly nimble. So buzzwords be damned. The team is very nimble. We've seen them move very quickly as conditions merit. So I think that's it for my slides. Thanks.
Yeah,
Dave.
I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
You talked about when you were a bench scientist, Matt, and you didn't want to look stupid. You sort of, you're working on experiments. Obviously, you were working on endeavors that required multiple people to work together. And so talk a little bit about how Scrum has reduced the stupidity feeling for the team. And I think it's really testament to that. The team cares about the team now. Is that perhaps part of the change? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, remember, the Scrum principles and the searching for safety, that's just good team management and good business. So I really appreciate, and I've talked to you guys about this a lot, is we can talk about artifacts and how Scrum works so well, but I think what I'm most thankful for is the overarching emphasis on team transparency and team safety. I think when you emphasize the transparency so much, you can't help but, even if you're not currently working on a given task or objective, you're absorbing that. And Scrum sort of forces you to absorb that stuff. So when all of a sudden you're shifted and now you're working on it, there's a lot, the learning curve is a lot shallower then. And so I can only speak for myself about always worrying about being dumb. But I know it's, I don't think I'm unique in that manner. So I think everybody being involved in the planning across, even if you're not currently working on a project, is really helpful.
So making people feel like they're part of something together, driving that feeling of a team, which, I mean, I'm reading lots of stuff into into what you wrote, but it's often the case that with research in particular, though you are in a team, you're still very much focused on your own objectives and your own needs and the like. And maybe by having that joint planning and that transparency of the sprint review and you're getting those things together, would that be a fair sort of assumption, and trying to make a feeling of team and team outcomes?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think you have a perfect read on it, right? There's always a balance between, team objectives and sort of even personal or professional development. And anytime you can wrap those two things together and have people have both of those sort of pushing somebody in the same direction, then you get really good outcomes, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. And then the last question I've got before we move on to Tyson, I'm really excited to hear you took all that learning and then made it even better at Dyno. But I'm interested to talk a little bit about COVID. And I loved what you said. And I've heard this a few times now, not just here, by the way. So love to hear this, that you didn't change anything. In terms of meeting cadence, communications, change it. A lot of organizations, when COVID hit, went into this over communication, lots more meetings on the books. Everybody was on Zoom forever. And you said that that's a great testament to the process because it is agile at its heart. So it responds to whatever environment throws at it. And you reduce the sprint length and just carried on. Was that a surprise? Did the team were the team surprised, or did they just sort of like stick their tongues out at the other parts of CRISPR Therapeutics and say, yeah, we just dealt with it because we're cool?
Well, I mean, you got to remember that a lot of things are very, there's a lot of cross-team coordination. So I don't think anybody's sticking anybody's tongues out.
Obviously, I was being facetious.
But
yes.
You know what? It was pretty interesting that we had, since we had discussed that the duration of sprints, for instance, are modifiable, and that's sort of something that the team discusses and decides on, not one person. When it was like, oh, look at the sort of work that we need to do here. We can shorten these sprints a little bit, and we're going to end up actually spending really not necessarily more time in sprint planning and review, but you're just going to sort of separate it out a little bit, and you're going to use that to, as conditions change. If you go back to the beginning of COVID, nobody really knew how long or I guess I didn't know how long that was going to last, right? I mean, there was I was looking through text messages a while back, and I think somebody said, do you think this will last till May? I think I answered, no, I think it'll be all set by then. So look at what that's done. So we didn't have to worry about whether we would be able to adapt. I think this framework was going to be pretty easy to adapt for that situation.
Cool. Excellent. Well, let's move on to it. And we've got loads of questions for you, Matt, but I'm going to bring those and weave those into the after Tyson's talk, because I think Tyson's going to have some interesting perspective on some of this, so it'll help maybe answer some of them. So let's move on and hear the exciting things at Dyno. You took all of that learning, right, Tyson? You sort of piloted it with poor old Matt, and then you went, let's grow this.
Got it. Well, Dave, I'll say I was scared. When we started this, I was a little worried that it wasn't gonna work. But I had confidence that through the framework itself, like the built-in reflection, the retrospective, the dailies, things like that people actually want anyway, that it was gonna work. And luckily in the first few sprints, I saw the trajectory going in that way. But let's go to the next slide. Talk a little bit about the company of Dyno Therapeutics. So ultimately our goal is to enable gene therapies for more patients. We do that through our closed loop process that I'll talk about here, and also partnering with capable gene therapy product developers. So right now, gene therapies are ultimately limited by the ability to deliver them to where they will make the biggest difference. And while there's different approaches at doing that, different technologies, viral delivery or non-viral delivery, I'll focus on the viral delivery aspect, that they're limited. And so what we do is we use machine-guided research in a closed-loop process to optimize a number of different properties at once, so that we can find vectors out there that our partners are going to want to license and use to deliver their payloads or their gene therapy products, ultimately resulting in safer, more efficacious products for all patients. So we can really broaden the number of people who can benefit from that. So you can see on the right, we really have a computational and then an experimental portion, where we'll start by designing that library. And then that library is just going to be, hundreds of thousands of variants, different sequences that we'll then build. We'll test that both in vivo and in vitro. And then we'll analyze that data, and that data goes back and we use that to design subsequent rounds. And so over time, that data builds upon itself. Currently, we have 50 employees, 10 teams in R&D, and we're looking to grow to 150 over the next 2 to 3 years. Next slide. As we think about our challenges, I think these challenges are not unique to Dyno. Biotech, especially in the Boston area, is a highly competitive labor market. I was just talking to our head of people yesterday, and she was telling me that biotech in Boston is approaching 30% year-over-year turnover, which is astounding to me. So organizations that can do better than the norm are going to have a competitive advantage. And I think to do that, you really need to provide a compelling work experience, not just to recruit people, but once they're there, give them a reason to say, hey, I can actually develop here. I can be the best person I can possibly be working for this organization and this mission. Additionally, a challenge is that what we're doing is being done for the first time. So we really need a model or framework that capitalizes on that experiential learning, so that as we go through something, we take that learning, we apply it. So very similar to our actual closed loop research process, we need to be thinking about how we worked in a similar way. Additionally, biological experiments are prone to failure in ways that can't even be predicted. And when they do fail, many times it's not as simple as a one-day fix. It may take weeks, months to redo what you had been spending your time on. So we need early and many opportunities to pivot what we do to maximize value in the organization. And I would say that our final challenge that's important to talk about is this balance between doing the work you need to do, but also developing technology at the same time that you're going to need. And you need to carve out space for both of it, and having a sprint that a team can do a review on and see that, we didn't get to the technology development stuff again for the third sprint in a row. Why? Let's understand that. And then let's figure out a way that we can make sure that we're able to do everything that we need to do, whether that means getting additional equipment, fixing supply chain issues, hiring more people, eliminating dependencies, whatever it is. That's an important challenge that we have, and I think everyone in biotech has, for that matter. Next slide, Dave. So we're a little bit different, and you'll see, for those that are familiar with Nexus or Scaled Scrum, we'll follow more of that model than the model that, or the framework that Matt showed you. We do it in 2-week sprints. While we started out initially doing a Monday to Friday every 2 weeks, due to challenges with holidays and people sometimes working over the weekend to plan for the next sprint, we figured that a different approach would be better, and we've moved to this concept of Agile Wednesdays, and we're currently finishing sprint 17 tomorrow and starting sprint 18 tomorrow. So what we do at the very start of this is we take a step back and we look at the roadmap. So this would be all of the production and some of the technical development that we need to accomplish, that we can foresee over the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months. And we make sure, does this make sense? And like with any cone of uncertainty, like the next few sprints worth, you're pretty confident that that's actually going to play out the way it is. You're much less confident the further away that goes. And so it's important to frequently take a look at it, because it involves a lot less work if you do it frequently than if you do it like infrequently, where then you got to open everything up. It's like open heart surgery, and it's really painful for everybody. So doing it frequently is really helpful for us. The product owners are really thinking about value. And then the Scrum Masters, we call them Agile Captains. They're really thinking about if this plan is achievable. So they're thinking about it from that perspective, and then they're providing that input. So that happens first, and then we start the Agile Wednesday. Each team meets individually, and they're doing their review of the previous sprint, the retrospective of the previous sprint, and they're agreeing to the goals that they want to accomplish in the upcoming sprint. Those are documented in what we call these outline documents. So there's basically 2 for each Agile Wednesday. One that you're filling out if you did it, if you're done, you're not done, like doing the review portion of it, of the previous sprint. And then one that's more focused on the next sprint, where you're putting your goals down for what you need to achieve upcoming. So all the product owners come together, we review that outline, make sure that we're all aligned on doing what's most important, answering any questions that need to be answered, resolving any conflicts. And then we do a retrospective at the company level. And this is really pulling on all the inputs from all the teams and seeing if we need to make any changes to how we work as an organization based on similarities that are emerging at the team level. After that, all the teams meet in the afternoon to do their individual sprint planning. So that's where they're taking those sprint goals and really breaking it down into like the discrete activities they need to do to achieve those goals. And then at the end of the day, all the product owners come back together and say, okay, do we have anything come up in the sprint planning we need to talk about? What we've seen is the lock-ins are really uneventful. Sometimes they don't even last more than 5-10 minutes, which is a good sign that things are working. And also, as we kick off the sprint, every team meets in the morning and does a 15-minute daily that Matt talked about. And then in the afternoons, we also do a daily at the company level. We're talking about cross-team conflicts or challenges that need to be resolved. Next slide, Dave. So, wow, it's not all hunky-dory. Everything's not going swimmingly. It's a constant effort. It's a lot of hard work to like evolve how we work together as the company is constantly changing. There are a lot of positive signs, though, that we're moving in the right direction. But it's something that like you just can't say, oh, we're done, walk away, and expect it to work. It takes a lot of work. And so as I think about the early positive signs, think about that from sustainability, openness, commitment, accountability, and how we're able to adapt. And you can see here just some points that I think are important to take away. Like the vocabulary is normalized. Like people are just freely saying, oh, I can't get to that in sprint 17, we'll do that in sprint 18. People are comfortable with the cadence. It's like one less thing to think about. It just like happens. And while the feedback is not all positive, is generally positive with feedback on how we can improve, which is what we want to look for. Another important thing we try to do is keep the time commitment for all these events to less than 10% of everybody's time. I think there's a constant need in our industry to say, oh, you're taking me away from the bench. But planning is critical for both rigorous science and then rigor around making sure the company is all rowing in the same direction. And so I think 10% has been a way to look at this that's been accepted by the organization as being, you know, okay, an okay trade-off. And then balance is always hard. Like initially we saw a lot of sprints that where there was a lot of undone work. Gradually it's gotten better, but it's a constant challenge. And even Dave told me this, that like, even having done this for so long, you know, that's still a hard thing to master. So it makes me feel a little bit better about what we're doing and how we're doing it. Another thing that popped up for us is that we realized early on that the non-R&D portions of the company, they inject work that R&D wasn't necessarily taken into consideration. And so they planned their sprint assuming they had 100% of the time. In reality, they didn't. And so before we start the Agile Wednesday, G&A injects basically all the needs they have of R&D. So that's factored in. Talked about the roadmaps and the outlines. Those are documents that people refer to have that openness and transparency. The dailies are allowing these discussions that sometimes slip through the cracks to emerge and be resolved, but not just in like a corner between two people, but in front of other people you may not realize need to know that information. For commitment and accountability, I think I saw a question in the Q&A. You know, yeah, like Matt said, some of these experiments take a month, but you can break it down to reasonable chunks. And I think people have gotten better at doing that. And you can really break something down, even down to like a one step in a protocol. So the question here is like, where do you break it down? And coming down to a 2-week sprint seems to make a lot of sense for what's meaningful, a good balance for us. We tie in the way we do quarterly goals with our sprint goals, so it's connected. Accountability is happening.
Sorry.
Yeah. Accountability is happening as well with those review and retrospectives. So if things aren't done, we're really, you know, wondering why and what we can learn from that at the team and company level. Retrospectives, we look to improve the way we do Agile. Yeah, adaptability down there as well. I feel like I'm reading through this slide and I did not intend to do that. But let me just cover, I think the one important thing at the bottom around retrospectives, uncovering root causes for challenges. A lot of times without that retrospective time carved out for that, teams won't take the time necessarily to understand that root cause. They'll focus on the symptoms. And I think that's been a helpful outcome for us as well, to really understand what is impacting the system. Next slide, Dave. As we think about the next steps for us, you know, we're in a constant state of change as an organization. If we want to keep people, we want to retain talent, and also at the same time give our framework flexibility. We need to encourage training, cross-training, so people like RAs, scientists can do more than what's maybe in their team. And as our workflow is lumpy, it's not like steady. We need to have the ability to react to that. And so training comes into that. And I think, as Matt's told me in the past, skills for scientists and RAs are research associates are like currency. And it's really important. And so that's what they're looking for when they're moving organizations too. So why not just give them that opportunity within your own company? Also, dependencies are something that we realized early on was causing conflict. Again, going back to that like root cause. And so as we grow, it's not simply just hiring more people. It's actually doing that with gradual organizational change that is focused on removing dependencies that are impeding the velocity of our teams. So that, you know, there's more autonomy at a team by team level. And I think that's all a question in the Q&A about how do you scale this for a big company? And I think a big piece of that is you just can't simply scale it for a big company. You really need to think about how to tackle those dependencies at the same time or even before you try to do something like that. And then lastly, we're moving to this idea of a third version of Agile at Dyno. And So we're really thinking about what we need to change to make sure we can accommodate, let's say, 80 or 90 people, because the way we work today isn't going to work for 50% larger organization. We want to have that model ready, so when we do need it, we can just like slide it right in. It's ready to go.
Thanks, Tyson. Before we move to the general Q&A, there's a couple of things I think that you highlighted that I just want to pull on a little bit more. One was around this idea that the retros, you actually do organizational redesign, because from when you identify things from the retros, so you're continuously reorganizing your organization. I mean, obviously not rapidly, like everybody's going to do this now, but you are using that to really feed how this organization adapts and changes as it grows, right?
Correct.
And how's that? Is that something that one criticism that's often levied at Scrum and these ideas, particularly in traditional big industrial organizations, is you can't change everything all the time. Did you find that the teams were very amenable to how things changed and how they worked, or were they resistant, or is it just a natural part of who Dyno Therapeutics is now?
Yeah, so I think change is expected in an organization. It's kind of one of the expectations. I mean, and I think it's a little bit different than what I've seen in other organizations. When you're a scientist, like you expect change all the time. You don't know what you're going to learn, and then it's going to impact what you do next. Why not think about work the same way? Or you can't expect the way you're working to be the same way when the organization's different. So I think a little bit of that is the organization is a little bit more open to that. Yeah. But also I think as we think about change, when I said earlier, Agile 1.0, Agile 2.0, Agile 3.0, those are like the major structural changes that take place. And there's a lot of information that supports why we're doing that. And so when we communicate out those changes, every single change is tied to why. And I think that helps. And we'll continue to do that for Agile 3.0. All the mini changes that happen, after each sprint. I'm not saying some sprints there's no changes, but the ones that do happen, they're like the simple fixes. They're kind of like the patch you put on there just to get to the gas station to change your tire. And then changing the tire is like going from Agile 2.0 to Agile 3.0.
Interesting. The other thing is, I think it highlights the fact that when you talked about why, those, you use OKRs, right, at Dyno. And so OKRs, the very nature of them, it's all about communicating objective or intent or goal, and I think that's throughout your organization. So your backlogs, though they do have things, task type stuff, there's always an element of the why. Would that be right?
Yes. And I'd say we still have work to do with how we implement OKRs. We're not doing it exactly how John Doerr prescribes for effective results. And I think a lot of that is due to, we don't know all the measures yet. We don't know what's the most important metric. And I think you need those metrics to be able to write really good key results. So as we're doing that, I think we're gradually getting better with OKRs. But in the meantime, we're thoughtful each quarter as we set those objectives and key results at the team level. They're not done at the individual level, that it ties directly to the work that is in your product backlog and you will eventually tackle during that sprint. And I think that's the connection that I think I brought up earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the reasons why Product Goal was added to the Scrum Guide in November was to try to get that sort of evolution of why to how to implement, and then back again, and then make it transparent. The great thing is you review your OKRs every cycle, right? So that gives you the opportunity to change things, to change priorities. Those product owners get that approach, which is really, really cool. Thanks, Tyson. Thanks, Matt. I think you've set a really good context for our viewers. That sounds very TV-y. Sorry about that. There's one question that's been brought up in multiple times, Alexandra brings it up, and then it was brought right early on by somebody. I think Sue brought it up. It's really about this sprint length and the science doesn't lend itself into a sprint. So what do you do? How long, Matt, obviously your sprints were a month at the start, then they went to 1 week when you were doing less clinical and more, so less bench, sorry. I always get these words wrong, sorry, apologies. And then you moved back to 2 weeks as you sort of came back into the premise, and yours have always been 2 weeks, I think, Tyson. So you talk about breaking things down. Can I review, maybe start, Matt, with you? What can you share about how you break things down? How do you make sure that a sprint actually has value, that sprint review is valuable?
Okay, so this was also my concern when we started looking into this before I was anything. I said these experiments take months sometimes. And I think one of my first questions was, well, can I make the sprint really long? And it's like, and then we went through all the reasons why we don't want to make the sprint excessively long. What I'll tell you is that when we were kicking this off with the team, Tyson was there. I think we spent multiple sessions learning how, Tyson and I had an idea of how this would look, and it always sounds simple on paper. Like, well, let's just break down the experiments into discrete chunks, right? Like setup, dosing, like weighting, analysis, this sort of stuff. Why don't we break them up, and we'll try to break them down into sprint-sized chunks. And that in general works really well. But there are specific cases where it took some give and take from the actual scientific team to be like, wait a second, and they'll find, and I'm not gonna be able to pull it off the top of my head right now, but they would find individual cases where it's like, wait, this card, it's not sprint sized necessarily, or how do we break it down? So we spent a lot of time moving through probably 95% of the cases where people couldn't figure out how to break it down to be right sized, and try to figure out, like, do we need to label the cards by size? Do we need to label the cards by, or the tasks by who's involved? And it actually, I think we've come to a point where most cases it's worked out just right, but the question is hitting it on the head. It took some practice from the bench folks, from the scientists, the people actually doing the work, to break these things down in their mind into distinct sprint duration chunks.
And your sprint reviews are still, you talk about the findings from the experiments at the sprint reviews, right?
Yeah, so what existed well before any of us were there in any sort of lab situation is either a group meeting or a lab meeting, whatever it is. And those are usually focused towards talking about the actual data that's generated and the analysis of it. What we focus on during the sprint review is talking about basically a very quick thumbnail, like 2 sentences of what we learned, and a little more about giving as much information as possible so that knowing what's going into the next sprint, giving some context to that. And so that's a weird line to have to delineate for people. That's not natural, right? It's like, well, no, when we talk about the work, we talk about the data. It's only data. It's just data. And it's like, well, no, there's more there than just like the numbers and the pictures and stuff, right? And so that's where we really separated those two things.
I think that's really interesting, because that's not just true of this industry, it's all industries. There's a propensity at a sprint review to want to show off everything you've done, but you really are only interested in showing off the stuff that you've done as it pertains to what you're going to do next. It's about learning, it's about inspection and adaptation through transparency. Don't get me wrong, let's celebrate occasionally as well. It's always good to, take a bottle of champagne into a sprint review, right? But that I think that's key to how you make your sprint reviews, because obviously there's a lot of really deep science stuff that I would not understand a moment of that needs to be discussed, but that isn't what you do at the sprint review. You take a little overview of it and then what things are pertinent to what we're going to do next. And I think that's really, really interesting. Tyson, anything to add about breaking work down and the challenges that you found?
I'd take a little bit of a step back too on this one. Like, in my days that I was in drug development, I'd see these Gantt charts with like a 6-month block that says like IND enabling or some chunk of work. And I'm like, what is that? Like, and I tend to think that people are apt to do that, to go the simple route, because it's easy. And because in a way it avoids accountability. Because if I'm not going to put down on paper, like, hey, I'm going to try to accomplish this, then you're apt not to have to deal with somebody coming back to you and holding you accountable. I think that anything can be broken down, even down to the protocol. For an experiment in a lab, you'll have a protocol that will define step by step what you need to do, and how long each step takes is pretty evident in that protocol. So you could figure out what your workflow should be, that you can achieve something of reasonable value within that 2-week period of time, and make that the cutoff. Okay, we're going to do this, boom, then it's done. And we're going to talk about it. So I like to think that what we're trying to do here is setting a framework in place that encourages accountability to happen. And I don't buy into that idea that like you can't break something down sufficiently. The challenge is how much. You break it down too much, you do weekly sprints, you're going to maybe burn people out by doing too many meetings. If you do a monthly sprint or quarterly sprint, whatever you choose to do, you may be missing out on a lot of opportunities to pivot the organization, or your team.
Cool. I think that it's tricky, but then there's the work, and it takes practice. I love what Matt said there. I think practice, and obviously you were both working on that. You both lived through those moments. So there's a lot of questions about product ownership, and not just in terms of who performs the role, but how is the backlog created, who takes own, et cetera, et cetera. So in Tyson, in Dyno, who acts as the product owner? Because you've got some interesting challenges, because the product owners have a couple of hats, which makes it a little bit difficult, right?
We've moved away from that model. Initially, we had some product owners that had to also be program leads, but now that's changing. And in a way to address dependencies, those PELs will eventually become product owners of themselves and have their own program team, where they'll call on the other teams to support them as needed, but they'll do a lot of the work themselves, hopefully in the longer term. And that'll address the whole dependency thing. But to answer that question that you brought up, our team leads our product owners are our team leads. So if you look at our closed loop process, you can look at it as a workflow, and we have various teams along that closed loop that operate together. And so that the team lead that manages the people on that team is going to be that product owner.
Yeah. And what about Matt at CRISPR? What are you guys doing, CRISPR Therapeutics?
So our product owner is a VP level person who's running this functional area. There's a little bit of, I'm not going to break it down into like functional areas versus programs, but yeah, so it's a little more straightforward in my situation because we're one group among many at CRISPR. So we didn't really have too hard of a time delineating that. We got a product owner who used to be, imagine, just would be called the program lead for all these different programs. Now it's just the product owner. We have the team, and then we have me as the Scrum Master right now. Typically, my job titles is Program Manager.
And did they find both of you? So when you said, "Hey, I want you to be the product owner," what did these people say? It was not a problem because it just fitted to what they normally do anyway, or was it a little bit of a, hey, what's this backlog thing? Do you have to teach people how to manage backlog and all of that kind of stuff?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, look, when we were pitching it, it was big thing for our team was we have the bench folks, the scientists of all levels, put cards into the product backlog. And then the PO's job is really to prioritize those. And so in a way, you're pitching two things. One, for the PO, it's like, hey, this is a little easier now, right? Like you're gonna push this on to other people. And then your job is to go, oh, that's really important, or this is not that important right now. So that was a benefit. PO loved that idea. It was just executing on that is a change. And we really pushed for the scientists and for everybody. The fact that you're putting the work into the product backlog, that's making you think like the next step up, right? Like eventually maybe you'll be a product owner or a program lead or something. And so that ties into the trying to find benefits for everybody. And so it's making everybody think, you know, and I think I'm stealing this from Tyson because Tyson really thought of this, but it's making everybody think one step higher than where they are now. And it's just like, you know, you want to dress for the job you want, right? So, so I think that's
training your replacement. That came from my airport days, right? You're going to be gone in 2 to 4 years, so you better train your replacement now.
Yeah, that's kind of a sad outlook, but yeah, great. As I look around my empty office, but so there's been a couple of questions, one around regulatory, user documentation, all of those other things. Now, both for you organizations, you're kind of like, you're in that research world, right? You're like, you don't have to do compliance. There's no oversight. There's none of that. Or am I just completely wrong? Is there actually other stakeholders that slow the system down, that impose requirements on you that are challenging?
I mean, I wouldn't say stakeholders from the traditional sense of, let's say, like the FDA or some sort of governmental agency, but I would say the dependencies brought on by the work we choose to outsource. Let's say we use clinical research organizations that, you know, maybe do certain experiments for us, or they do things that we can't do. So we'd be really thoughtful about, and we've gone through exercises like this, make or buy. And so we try to limit that as much as possible because it does introduce dependencies.
Yeah, but you're very core. You also do core and context. What are we focused on? What's our skill? And then I think that's interesting. How do you manage those dependencies, Tyson? I mean, what happens? Because do they run using Scrum? I'm sure they don't, right? They're like, they have the huge, complicated Gantt chart that 87 people have to print out and carry to you. How does that work? I don't know if there's 87 people. So.
I would say we're getting better at it. It takes a lot of effort. I mean, that's where vendor management comes in. One of the things that we've done with one of our vendors that's really critical for us is we've set expectations. So yeah, you have your contract, your statement of work, your MSA, all those documents that no one ever reads, put together, yes. Like, no kidding, one pager. Let's stick to this. And so we commit to certain things. We have the vendor commit to certain things. So one of the things we commit to, for example, is every sprint, I take our roadmap and I condense it into the information they need to know about when they're going to get the test article from us, so that they can, on their end, adjust where our study fits in within their workflow. So really respecting the needs of those that you need to work with, I think can do wonders with trying to reduce those dependencies. And so far we've done pretty well with that.
What about you, Matt? Do you have externals that come in and say, we need a statement of work and it needs to, or any
yeah, I mean, we have contract work as well. But I think more specifically for this, what we also have is, so we have a functional area that's very heavily invested in this, but there's a lot of cross-functional work. So there's other functions that do not operate under Scrum typically, or not Agile typically, that help, or that give a lot of work to these programs. And all we did was we invited all those people that were working for the teams into the group, and then had to give them a very too brief overview of how Scrum works, how our team uses it specifically, and what we ask from each of the members. And so I have people from all over the place that, their home teams don't even know what Scrum is necessarily, but they are fully integrated in it. They put cards in, they're using it, and they do it because it's helpful for their own planning.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. So we're coming up to time, and I guess I would love an opportunity, or provide some space maybe for you to share perhaps, what would your advice, we've got a lot of people on the webinar in situations that maybe they're thinking about applying some of this stuff. what would be your words of wisdom? What would you be like? How do you get started? What would be the thing that you would focus on first? I know, as Tyson, you were instrumental for starting at both these organizations. What would yours be first? Maybe you'd like to start, and then Matt, you carry on.
I'd say start small, identify a problem where this would address it.
That's nice.
And show value early, and then build from there. But don't try to tackle everything at once.
Cool. Start small, get some value out, actually get some improvement, get people on board, and then grow. Nice. Matt, anything to add to that?
David, just once, people might think, well, you didn't start small at Dyno. I mean, it was like 25 people when I started. So I do see that as small. If I came into Dyno as a 50, 60 person company, I probably would rethink the approach.
Cool. Thanks, Tyson. Matt, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, that's a big deal. Is you got to find like a little nucleation site, right? Where are we going to start this thing from? And if you're in a larger company, you're not going to get everybody to switch over like this. I mean, there will be a lot of pushback from that. So I don't know if I have too much more to add to what Tyson said. I think he's got it exactly right. What I would add is to try to identify like an internal champion. I hate to turn this into biotech thing, but like when you're pitching, trying to license something to another company, you really want to identify one person in that company that will like go to bat for you, right? And this is the same sort of thing. And I think it's extremely useful to have a couple people going to bat for you in your organization than it is to have one very loud person, right? I mean, because you've already demonstrated, look, the idea has spread from me to one other person. And so try to identify that stakeholder that can help you push forward.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I know we've come up to our time. We're slightly over, actually. There's a million questions. What I'm going to do is, well, I'll get these questions to you. One of our lunchtime conversations that we have. We can maybe start looking at these questions. Maybe write some blogs to respond to them, because I think there's some interesting questions there. So, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize if I haven't got to all of your questions. There were some awesome ones. Thank you so much for taking the time for today. I'd like to thank Matt, and Tyson. Thank you. Thank you for the last 18 months. You've taught me so much. You've got me out of my ivory tower and made me think about things in different ways. I've learned a little bit about biotech, which I forget on a regular basis, but so I appreciate that. So thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time today to share your insights with the audience. Thank you for the audience for coming. Hopefully you found some value out of it. And hopefully this might start a few meetings like this or a few sessions like this. I know I'm certainly passionate about it. So thanks, everybody. And I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out.